task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Redlining refers to a federal and local governmental practice, acting together with private banks, to systematically deny home loans to Black people. 175 redlining was accomplished at the federal level with 3 agencies: Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, VA, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. 376 the VA helped new homeowners buy houses, 377 the VA helped veterans. 2 and others, 378, and HOLC helped prevent foreclosures as a result of the Great Depression for existing homeowners, 379. These 3 federal agencies helped millions of mostly white Americans buy houses by insuring and subsidizing mortgages, while refusing the same opportunity to African Americans. 380 or, in the words of the federal agencies, exclusion was directed at inharmonious racial group or nationality groups. 381. The federally insured mortgage, the federal government protects lenders, like banks, against losing money. If the homeowner stops paying their mortgage, the federal government would step in and pay the bank amount of the unpaid principal in the loan. 82 As a result, banks were far more willing and likely to issue an insured mortgage to a white applicant than an uninsured mortgage to a Black applicant. 383. With these mortgages, white Americans moved out of America's city centers, taking with them their middle-class tax bases into the suburbs and leaving urban poverty in its wake. 84 Unable to access the same mortgages to reach the suburbs, African Americans remained in the impoverished urban centers. 385. Practice continued legally until 1962, when President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order prohibiting the use of federal funds to support racial discrimination in newly constructed housing. 386 Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loans, 98% of which went to white people. 387. Though redlining is no longer legal, its effects appear to endure. One study has found associations between historically redlined neighborhoods, air pollution and cancer, asthma, poor mental health, and people without health insurance. 88 The same study also found that residents in certain historically redlined areas were close to twice as likely to have poor health when compared to areas that did not have redlining. 389. Loan Corporation. Homeowners Loan Corporation refinanced tens of thousands of mortgages in danger of default or foreclosure and issued low-interest loans to help homeowners recover homes that were already foreclosed. 390 Between July 1933 and June 1935, HOLC used $1 billion to finance more than 1 million mortgages. 391. Examiners assessed real estate values and mortgage lending risks for 239 mid-sized cities between 1939 and 1945, and developed residential security maps for the entire country. 392. These maps rated neighborhoods from A, for the best neighborhoods, to D, the worst neighborhoods. 93 Grade A was shaded in green on the maps and assigned to blocks in neighborhoods that were new and all white. 94 HOLC assigned Grade B, shaded in blue, to stable, outlying, Jewish and white working class neighborhoods. 95 Grade C was for inner-city neighborhoods bordering mostly Black communities or neighborhoods that already had a small Black population and shaded yellow. 396 Grade D was the worst category and reserved for all Black neighborhoods, even if it was middle class, and shaded in red. 397 This process was called redlining. 398. Debate the level of direct influence these maps had on how banks made their decisions. 399, but generally agree that redlining resulted in the devaluation of Black homes across the entire country, making it difficult for African Americans to buy, build, renovate their homes. 400. The 1939 Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual, the Hulk Residential Security Maps cemented the federal government's support of the routine real estate industry practice of devaluing real estate owned by non-white property owners. 401, a practice that continues to this day. 402. Homeowner Paul Austin testified during the October 13, 2021 task force meeting that a home appraiser valued the property of he and his wife at just below $1 million, which was much less than they expected because of significant improvements they had made to their home. Asked a friend to pretend to be his wife, removed anything in their house that would indicate their race, and hired a different appraiser. Appraiser valued the property at just less than $1.5 million, which was nearly $500,000 more than the previous estimate. Austin also testified his grandparents migrated from the South to the Marin City area during 1940s to work in the shipyards, but were trapped in that area because of redlining. He also testified that his paternal grandparents secretly purchased land and built a home in Mill Valley because African Americans were not allowed to buy property in the area. Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration. Congress created the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 to ensure bank mortgages for first-time homeowners. 3. Where the Homeowners Loan Corporation reinforced segregation by creating the Residential Security Maps, the FHA issued the FHA Underwriting Manual. 104. The 1936 manual warned of the increased risk that a homeowner would not pay their mortgage in a neighborhood with inharmonious racial groups. 405. 1947 and 1958 versions of the FHA Underwriting Manual did not directly mention race, but instructed mortgage lenders to consider physical and social attractiveness and whether the families living in the neighborhoods were congenial when evaluating the credit risk. 6. State-regulated insurance companies, like the Equitable Life Insurance Company and the Prudential Life Insurance Company, also declared that their policy was to not issue mortgages to whites in integrated neighborhoods. 407. FHA refused to insure mortgages for African Americans. Banks shouldered additional risk if they loaned to black families rather than white families, so they essentially did not do so. 408. Between 1935 and 1950, the FHA administered 2,761,000 home mortgages, and only about 50,000 were made available to non-white Americans. 409. In addition to encouraging banks to discriminate against African Americans in the credit assessment process, author Richard Rothstein argues that FHA made its biggest impact when it financed the development of entire suburbs. 410. When the FHA reviewed plans for suburban development projects, it demanded that the real estate developer not sell houses to African Americans and sometimes withheld approval of the projects if black families lived in nearby neighborhoods. In 11. Once the real estate developer built the housing development to the federal government's specifications, including a prohibition on selling to black families, white buyers did not need to have their new house appraised for the federal government to guarantee their mortgages. 412. Without FHA or Veterans Administration financing, developers built inferior neighborhoods without community facilities like parks and playgrounds. 413. Further discussion of the health impact of a lack of green space is discussed in Chapter 7 on the environment. As African Americans could not access mortgages, many houses in these neighborhoods were rental properties instead. Families were deprived of this opportunity to build wealth. 414. A 1967 study showed that out of 400,000 housing units in FHA-insured subdivisions, only 3% had been sold to black families. 415. For World War II, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, offering education, small business and union benefits to military veterans. The GI Bill also authorized the VA to insure mortgages for veterans as the FHA did for civilians. It adopted FHA housing policies, and VA appraisers relied on the FHA's underwriting manual. 416. The VA guaranteed approximately $5 million nationally. 417. By 1950, the FHA and VA together were insuring half of all new mortgages nationwide. 418. Government approval, white veterans often did not need a down payment to buy a home. 19. Although the GI Bill itself did not contain a single loophole for different treatment of white and black veterans, reality was very different. 420 The approval of GI Bill benefits for each individual application was dependent in the South on the almost entirely white employees working at local VA centers, local banks, or public and private schools. 421 is a black veteran in Texas wrote to the NAACP, no Negro veteran is eligible for a loan. 422 The VA refused to keep racial records. 423 A survey of 13 cities in Mississippi showed that by mid-1947, only 2 of the 3,229 VA guaranteed loans went to black veterans. 424 In 1950, of the almost 70,000 VA mortgages issued in the New York, New Jersey area, non-whites received less than 100. 425 Many black World War II veterans never applied for GI Bill guaranteed mortgages because they knew that they would not be approved because of race. 426 California. There's Loan Corporation maps described many Californian neighborhoods in racially discriminatory terms. In Berkeley, the whole characterized an area north of the University of California, Berkeley as high yellow, C, but for infiltration of Orientals and gradual infiltration of Negroes from south to north. 427 In Pasadena, this area is favorably located but is detrimentally affected by 10 owner-occupant Negro families. Although the Negros, sick, are said to be of the better class, their presence has caused a wave of selling in the area, and it seems inevitable that ownership and property values will drift to lower levels. The area is accorded A solely on account of racial hazards. As a medial yellow grade would have been assigned. 428 In Oakland, detrimental influences, predominance of Negroes and Orientals. Also mixed classes of wage earners and colored professional people. 429 In San Diego, there were servants areas of La Jolla and several areas restricted to the Caucasian race. 430 Many neighborhoods financed by the federal government were for white people only. Westlake in Daly City, south of San Francisco. Lakewood, south of Los Angeles. Westchester, south of Los Angeles, and developed by Kaiser Community Homes. Panorama City, in the San Fernando Valley. The Sunkist Gardens development in southeast Los Angeles. 431 The Federal Housing Administration approved subdivision plans, and real estate developers built homes that black workers could not buy due to the restrictions demanded by the FHA. Families were forced to move to a segregated neighborhood or live in nearby Richmond. 432 In Ladera, a neighborhood next to Stanford University, the FHA refused to finance the construction of a co-op suburb with black members. In 33 Without the government insuring its mortgages, the co-op could not find financing to build their homes, so they gave up, and the land was sold to a private developer. 134 Shortly after, the FHA approved the private developer's plans, which contained a guarantee that no homes would be sold to black families. 435 California, from 1946 to 1960, 350,000 new homes were built with support from the FHA, but fewer than 100 of these homes went to black people. 436 Only did federal agencies refuse to insure mortgages to African Americans, they also refused mortgages to white Americans who attempted to live alongside African Americans. 1954, a resident of the white-only neighborhood of East Palo Alto sold his house to a black family. 437 This sparked a phenomenon called blockbusting, in which local real estate agents exploited racial fears and manipulated white residents to sell their houses at a low price, then the houses at a higher price to black families. 438 As white residents fled the neighborhood, other white homeowners became desperate to sell their houses at even lower prices. 439 1970 report concluded that the average markup black families paid in blockbusted neighborhoods was 80 to 100% higher than neighborhoods not undergoing racial change. 140 In response to blockbusting in East Palo Alto, the California Real Estate Commissioner stated that the commission did not regulate such unethical practices. 441 and Veterans Administration policies discouraged white residents from moving into but in the process of being integrated like East Palo Alto at the time, since the government did not insure mortgages for white families in integrated neighborhoods where black families lived. 142 within 6 years, the population of East Palo Alto was 82% black, and housing conditions had deteriorated markedly. 443. Another example, in 1958, a black San Francisco school teacher named Alfred Simmons rented a house with a fee-guaranteed mortgage from a fellow white school teacher in the Elmwood district of Berkeley. 444. The Berkeley police chief requested that the Federal Bureau of Investigation investigate how Mr. Simmons came to live in an all-white community, and the FBI referred the case to the U.S. 445. The FBI advised the white homeowner that because he rented his house to a black colleague, any future application from him will be rejected on the basis of an unsatisfactory risk determination made by this office on April 30, 1959. 446. 7. Racially restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants are legally binding contracts, usually written into the deed, that prohibit non-white people from living on a property or in a neighborhood. 447. For example, a deed in 2010, in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, included the following clause, introduced in 1946: the said land shall not be sold, leased, or rented to any person other than of the Caucasian race, or to any entity of which any person other than that of said race. The member, stockholder, officer, or director. 448. By helping preserve segregation and a system of racial hierarchy, such covenants are yet another example of the enduring effects of slavery. Restrictive covenants began appearing in the late 19th century and were first directed against Chinese and Punjabi residents in California. 449. By 1900, developers began inserting them into the deeds of homes built in new subdivisions all across the country. 450. Minneapolis, Minnesota had racially restrictive covenants as early as 1910 and late as 1955. In 51. Further, between 1923 and 1924, real estate boards in Milwaukee, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, and other cities prohibited their realtors from selling or renting property in white neighborhoods to African Americans. 452. 1923 and 1924, real estate boards in Milwaukee, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, and other cities prohibited their realtors from selling or renting property in white neighborhoods to African Americans. Advised the white homeowner that because he rented his house to a black colleague, any future application from him will be rejected on the basis of an unsatisfactory risk determination made by this office on April 30, 1959. 1917, racial zoning, discussed earlier in this chapter, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, 453, but the Supreme Court declared that racially restrictive covenants did not violate the Constitution in 1926. 54. The Supreme Court reasoned that the covenant was a contract between private individuals not subject to state control. 455. Officials began promoting racially restrictive covenants as an alternative, constitutional way to maintain segregation. In 56, President Herbert Hoover opened the President's Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership by declaring that single-family homes were expressions of racial longing and had our people should live in their own homes is a sentiment deep in the heart of our race. 157. Conference materials then recommended that all new neighborhoods include appropriate restrictions, such as barring the sale of homes to African Americans. 458. Federal officials also recommended homeowners form restricted residential districts, which may serve as protection against persons with whom your family won't care to associate, provided the restrictions are enforced and are not merely temporary. In 59, these racially restrictive districts appeared soon afterwards and functioned like bylaws in a neighborhood association, and a neighbor could sue to evict a black family that bought a house in the neighborhood. 460. Have found that wealthy white communities used restrictive covenants, while white working-class communities used a combination of violence and covenants to keep African Americans from moving into their neighborhoods. 461. Simultaneously, government actors and real estate agents often used different mechanisms to segregate a neighborhood. 1936 Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual stated that zoning regulations alone are not enough to assure a homogeneous and harmonious neighborhood. Deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances. Recommended restrictions include Prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended, and appropriate provisions for enforcement. 462 The 1938 Underwriting Manual stated clearly, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. 463 The Veterans Administration also recommended and frequently demanded that racial covenants be added into the deeds of the mortgages it sponsored. 464 Racially restrictive covenants appeared all over the country. By 1940, according to news reports quoted in the 1973 U.S. Civil Rights Report, 80% of homes in Chicago and Los Angeles contained restrictive covenants barring black families. 65 A survey of 300 developments built between 1935 and 1947 in the suburbs of New York City found that 56% of the 300 developments and 85% of larger subdivisions had racially restrictive covenants. 466 University of Chicago subsidized the homeowners association surrounding its campus. From 1933 to 1947, it spent $100,000 on legal services to defend racially restrictive covenants and evict African Americans who moved into the neighborhood. 467 Over the country, white neighbors sued their black neighbors to prevent them from moving into or to evict them from their legally purchased homes. 1968 and 1942, the Oklahoma Supreme Court not only declared that the property purchased by a black buyer was void due to a racial covenant, but it also ordered the black buyer to pay for the court costs and attorney's fees of the white neighbor who sued. 169 in Westlake in Daly City, California, the total fine of $16,000 for selling to a black family was greater than the typical home sale price. 470. 48. The Supreme Court reversed course from its 1926 decision and held that although the government had no control over whether a racially restrictive covenant can be added to a deed, it is unconstitutional for American courts to recognize and enforce the covenants. 471. Restrictive covenants were so widespread by then that 3 of the Supreme Court justices recused themselves from the case because they owned houses covered by racially restrictive covenants. 472. Weeks after the court announced its decision, Commissioner Franklin D. stated that the decision would in no way affect the programs of this agency, which would make no change in our basic concepts or procedures. 473 in 1952, the Commissioner stated that it was not the purpose of the to segregation or to deny the benefits of the National Housing Act to persons who might be unwilling to disregard race, color, or creed in the selection of their purchasers or tenants. 474. Though racially restrictive covenants were declared unconstitutional in 1948, their popularity continued for decades. 475, and racially homogeneous neighborhoods continued after these covenants ceased to be enforced. 176 John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush all lived in neighborhoods or homes with racially restrictive covenants. 477 The home that George W. Bush bought in 2008 was located where the neighborhood association enforced a racially restrictive covenant until 2000. 478 Ayers Park, a neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, the housing association appeared to be enforcing its racially restrictive covenant in 2010 when it added the covenant to its website. 479 restrictive covenants, and they were widely used throughout the state. 480 Like the rest of the country, all the racially restrictive covenants were private contracts. They worked in conjunction with federal policy to devalue black property and prevent African Americans from accessing home loans. The Homeowners Loan Corporation maps for Pasadena devalued the neighborhood because its restrictive covenants had expired, potentially allowing African Americans to move in. Its district was originally much smaller, but constant infiltration into other sections as deed restrictions expired has created a real menace which is greatly concerning property owners of Pasadena and Altadena. 481. Southern California, after its founding in 1903, the Los Angeles Realty Board campaigned to attach racially restrictive land covenants on as many new developments. 482 Paul R. Williams, a prominent black Los Angeles architect who designed houses for Frank Sinatra, Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz, and Cary Grant, could not legally live in the neighborhoods he designed due to restrictive covenants. 483 Williams taught himself to draw upside down because his white clients were uncomfortable sitting next to him and toured construction sites with hands clasped behind his back to avoid the situation where someone would refuse to shake a black man's hand. 484. 1937 to 1948, more than 100 lawsuits attempted to enforce covenants and evict black families from their homes in Los Angeles. 185 in one 1947 case, a black homeowner refused to leave the home he bought in violation of a covenant and he was jailed. 486 in Whittier, a Los Angeles suburb, the Quaker-affiliated Whittier College participated in a restrictive covenant applied to its neighborhood. 487. 43, the city attorney of Culver City, an all-white suburb of Los Angeles, narrated wardens that when they went door to door to make sure families turned off the lights, to avoid helping Japanese bombers find targets, to also circulate documents in which homeowners promised not to sell or rent to African Americans. 488. 2021, AB 1466 was enacted to require county recorders to identify and redact racially restrictive covenants from California real estate records. 489.